Richard Hale was known by everyone in the city. His name appeared in newspapers, on billboards, and in business magazines. People admired his success story. The man who built a company from nothing and turned it into one of the biggest firms in the country. His life looked perfect from the outside. Big house, luxury cars, and influence that reached every corner of his world. But behind the glass walls of his office and the marble floors of his mansion, there was a silence that no money could fill. He lived in a world of meetings, deals, and deadlines. His phone never stopped buzzing. Every day began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. To most, he was a man who had everything. But those who truly knew him, or at least tried to, saw something else. A man running from his own pain. That pain had a name. It was Daniel, his son. Daniel was only 8 years old, but his short life had already been filled with challenges. He was born with a neurological condition that left him unable to walk or speak. He spent most of his days in a wheelchair, his big brown eyes following people silently as they moved around him. He couldn't play outside like other kids, couldn't run, couldn't even say Dad. And yet, there was something gentle about him, something that made people feel calm when they looked into his eyes. Richard loved his son, though he didn't know how to show it anymore. After losing his wife, everything inside him changed. The accident had taken more than the woman he loved. It had taken away the laughter in his home, the warmth in his heart. He had promised her he'd take care of Daniel, but instead, he buried himself in work. He told himself he was doing it for Daniel's future, to give him the best doctors, the best nurses, the best care money could buy. But deep down he knew it wasn't just that. Work was easier than facing the sadness in his son's eyes. The house was huge, but it always felt empty. Staff moved quietly through the hallways, doing their jobs without speaking much. The walls that once echoed with his wife's laughter now carried only the soft hum of machines and the faint sound of Daniel's favorite lullaby playing on repeat. Every few months, there was a new nanny. They arrived full of hope, promising to help, smiling at the boy in the wheelchair and assuring Richard they could handle everything. But within weeks, they'd leave. Some said it was too hard emotionally. Some simply didn't understand how to connect with a child who didn't speak back. A few left without a word, unable to handle the weight of such a quiet home. Richard never asked why they left. He just told his assistant to find another one. One evening, he sat in his office at home, typing emails as the rain hit the large windows. Daniel was in his room upstairs, being fed by the latest nurse. Richard didn't look up when the doctor's report arrived in his inbox. He had read too many of them before, all saying the same thing. Daniel's condition was stable but unlikely to improve. He stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the laptop. For a moment, he looked at the photo frame on his desk, a picture taken years ago. His wife was smiling, holding baby Daniel in her arms. Richard stood beside her, younger, happier, full of hope. He hadn't looked like that in years. He turned the frame face down. The next morning, his assistant called. "Sir, I've found a new nanny candidate. She's worked with children with similar conditions. Should I set up an interview?" Richard sighed. "Fine, just handle it quickly." That afternoon, a quiet knock came at the office door. Richard barely glanced up as the assistant entered with a woman following behind. She looked simple, not like the polished nannies he was used to hiring. Her clothes were neat but plain. There was something calm about her, the kind of calm that didn't feel forced. She held a small folder of documents, her hands slightly nervous but her eyes steady. "Mr. Hale," the assistant said, "this is Emily Carter. She has several years of experience working with children with special needs." Richard nodded briefly. "Sit down." Emily sat. She didn't speak immediately. She waited, giving him time to lead the conversation. That small act of patience caught his attention, though he didn't show it. "You've done this kind of work before?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "For many years. I've cared for children with different conditions, some more challenging than others." Richard leaned back. "It's not easy here. Daniel doesn't talk. He needs full attention. Most people can't handle it." "I understand," she replied. "I'm not here because it's easy. I'm here because I care." He raised an eyebrow. He'd heard those words before from others who left a month later. "And what makes you think you can handle it when others couldn't?" For a moment she hesitated. "Because I've seen what love and patience can do. Sometimes a child doesn't need fixing. They just need someone who doesn't give up on them. Richard said nothing. He didn't believe in emotional speeches anymore. Still, there was something sincere in her tone. No dramatics, no fake confidence, just quiet belief. He looked down at her resume again. Her references checked out. Nothing special on paper, but something about her made him pause. Finally, he said, "You can start tomorrow." "Thank you, sir," she said, standing up. When she left, his assistant smiled faintly. "She seems kind. She seems ordinary," Richard replied. But deep inside, something told him this woman might be different, though he quickly brushed that thought aside. The next morning, Emily arrived early. She was greeted by the housekeeper, who gave her a tour of the mansion. Everything looked perfect: spotless floors, shining chandeliers, and walls covered with expensive art. But beneath that beauty, the air felt heavy. When she entered Daniel's room, she stopped. The boy sat by the window in his wheelchair, watching the trees sway outside. Sunlight touched his face, making his pale skin glow. He didn't look up when she came in. "Good morning," she said gently, walking closer. "I'm Emily. I'll be spending time with you." Daniel didn't respond, only blinked slowly. She smiled anyway. "That's okay. You don't have to say anything. I'm just happy to meet you." She began tidying his toys, not because the room was messy, but because she wanted to get a feel for the space. She placed a few books on the table, noticed a dusty piano in the corner, and softly brushed her hand across it. "Do you like music?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly toward the piano, then back to the window. That small movement told her everything she needed to know. Over the next few hours, she spoke to him as if he could understand every word. She told him stories, described the weather, even joked lightly about how quiet the house was. There was no response, but she didn't mind. She treated him like any other child, not as someone broken, but as someone waiting to be heard in a different way. Downstairs, Richard worked from his home office, occasionally hearing faint sounds from above. Emily's voice, the soft creak of the wheelchair, the distant sound of laughter. It was strange. Daniel never laughed. At dinner that night, Richard passed by the dining hall and froze. Emily was sitting beside Daniel, feeding him slowly while telling a story about a boy who wanted to touch the stars. Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile. For the first time in years, Richard stopped and watched quietly from the doorway. Something stirred in him, something he couldn't name. But as quickly as it appeared, he pushed it away and walked off. Later that night, the housekeeper found him standing in his study, staring out the window. "Sir, the new nanny seems to be good with Daniel," she said gently. "She just started," he replied coldly. "Let's see how long that lasts." But deep down, even he felt the smallest spark of curiosity. Something about the way Emily spoke to Daniel reminded him of his wife, patient, warm, and kind. As he stood there, the faint sound of a piano note drifted from upstairs. Just one single note followed by silence, then another. He looked up toward the ceiling, his heart strangely heavy. He couldn't tell if it was the sound of hope or just another reminder of how much he'd lost. Either way, it was the first night in years that he didn't work late. Instead, he sat in the quiet living room, listening to that soft, uncertain tune from above, the sound of two souls trying to find each other in the silence. The next morning, Emily arrived earlier than expected. The sun had just begun to stretch its light across the mansion, and the air was still cool and fresh. She carried a small bag with some of Daniel's favorite toys, a few storybooks, and a notebook where she kept ideas for activities. Her steps were quiet but purposeful, the kind that didn't disturb the house but still announced her presence. Richard was already in his office, immersed in reports. He barely looked up when she entered. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. He nodded, and she turned her attention to Daniel, who sat by the window, quietly observing the world outside. She knelt beside him, careful to meet him at eye level. "Hello again," she said, her voice gentle. "Did you sleep well?" Daniel didn't respond, but he watched her hands as she arranged his books neatly on the table. She didn't rush him. She had learned early on that patience spoke louder than words. Emily spent the morning exploring ways to connect with him. She tried simple games, tapping lightly on the table to see if he would mimic the rhythm. She held a soft ball in front of him, rolling it gently back and forth. His reactions were small at first, a blink, a slight turn of his head, but Emily celebrated each one quietly, nodding to herself. Richard noticed the faint sounds from upstairs, the soft clatter of toys, the whispered stories. For a moment he paused and felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Curiosity, maybe even hope. He had been so used to silence that these small noises unsettled him. He wanted to look, but he told himself it was not his place. By late morning, Emily had moved on to music. The piano in Daniel's room was old, with some keys that didn't work. Most people would have ignored it, but Emily sat beside it, brushing her hand over the worn keys. "Do you like music?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes followed her hand for a brief moment, the faintest glimmer of interest. She smiled. She played a simple tune, soft and slow, letting the notes fill the quiet room. Daniel listened. He didn't move at first, but gradually his fingers twitched slightly, almost in rhythm. Emily leaned closer. "That's it. Just like that," she said encouragingly. Her voice was never loud or pushy, only steady, gentle, and full of quiet hope. Lunch arrived in the form of a tray from the kitchen, but Emily ignored it. She was too engaged with Daniel, observing his subtle reactions. She noticed a slight tightening of his lips when he reached for a toy, the way his eyes followed her movements, the small ways he communicated without words. Every tiny gesture was a victory. Every small response was a story. When she finally turned to eat, she found Richard standing by the doorway. He had come upstairs quietly, watching the interaction without interrupting. Emily didn't notice him at first. She was fully present with Daniel. When she did, she nodded politely. "Sir," she said, "he's doing better than I expected." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to say more, to express some approval, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he left silently, but the image of Emily with Daniel lingered in his mind. There was something different about her. She treated Daniel like a child, not a patient. She didn't pity him. She didn't fear him. She simply connected. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Emily arrived early, leaving only when the house was still bathed in the soft evening light. She discovered small things about Daniel, how he liked the way the sunlight fell on the rug, how he responded to the sound of her voice when she whispered stories, how he seemed calmer when she sang softly while feeding him. Richard continued his work, traveling between the office and the mansion. He occasionally caught glimpses of Emily teaching Daniel, guiding his fingers across the piano, reading stories aloud, laughing quietly when Daniel mimicked a movement or made a small sound. At first he tried to dismiss it, telling himself that it was her doing all the work. But deep down he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, gratitude, maybe even shame at how little he had given his son. One afternoon, Emily decided to introduce a new activity. She brought out a small box of paints and brushes. Daniel had never painted before, and she wasn't sure how he would react. She placed the paper in front of him and handed him a brush, dipping it in a soft blue color. At first, he did nothing. His eyes followed the brush as she guided his hand gently over the paper. Slowly, he made a mark, a line, then another. Emily smiled. "Look at that." "You did it," she whispered. She didn't exaggerate, didn't make it a big show. She simply celebrated each small achievement as if it were monumental. Richard happened to pass by Daniel's room that evening. He stopped outside the door, watching silently. The sight struck him. Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor, guiding his son's tiny hand across the paper, her own hand steady and calm. Daniel's face showed a hint of concentration, the faintest expression of joy. For a moment, Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had never seen his son like this before. Later that evening, Emily took Daniel to the garden. The mansion had a small enclosed yard, with flowers along the edges and a swing hanging from a sturdy tree. She helped him touch the petals, smell the flowers, and listen to the sound of birds in the air. Daniel's hands moved slowly, his eyes following every detail. She didn't rush him, didn't try to force him to respond. She simply stayed beside him, a steady presence in a world that often felt too fast, too harsh. Richard noticed this as he walked past the window. He stopped. Something about seeing his son outside, moving slightly, interacting in a world he had kept distant, touched something deep inside him. For the first time, he considered what it meant to truly be present, not just for Daniel's care, but for Daniel's life. Over the next week, Emily continued to observe and learn. She discovered how Daniel preferred textures, what sounds made him calm and what small gestures brought him joy. She introduced simple routines, story time, music, painting, garden walks, that slowly became familiar and comforting. Each routine was carefully designed to make Daniel feel safe and valued. Richard began noticing changes subtle at first. The house no longer felt as silent. There was the occasional giggle, a soft coo, the faint sound of a piano note. Even when he didn't see it, he could hear it. It reminded him that life existed beyond contracts and boardrooms, beyond the endless demands of his company. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Emily stayed behind to tidy the room. She carefully wiped paint from his hands, arranged his toys, and sat by the piano for a moment. Her fingers hovered over the keys, pressing gently to see if he had left a mark of music behind. A single note sounded soft and uncertain. She smiled quietly. Richard, passing by the hallway, paused. He saw her in that moment, her patience, her dedication, her care. He felt something stir in his chest. He realized that for the first time someone had entered their home and truly connected with his son. Not for recognition, not for money, not even for approval, but because she cared. It was a strange feeling for him, one he hadn't expected. Pride, guilt, admiration, hope, and all tangled together. He turned away quietly, not ready to face it fully. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. For weeks, the house had been quiet and dull. Now it felt alive in a way he hadn't realized was possible. Emily's arrival had shifted something fundamental. She had not only begun to reach Daniel, but she had also begun to reach him, the father who had been so distant, so absorbed in work, so afraid to face his own emotions. The days continued, each one bringing new small victories. Daniel's movements became slightly more deliberate, his expressions more varied, his eyes brighter. Emily celebrated each achievement with quiet joy, never overdoing it, never making it about herself. And slowly, Richard began to pay attention, catching glimpses of these moments, feeling the stirrings of emotions he had buried long ago. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no magical transformations, just small human connections, the touch of a hand, the sound of a laugh, the look in a child's eyes. And that was enough to begin something powerful, something life-changing. Richard didn't admit it to anyone. Not the assistant, not the staff. But deep inside, he knew their lives were changing. Emily was doing more than anyone else ever had. She was bringing life back into the house, back into his son, and even, slowly, back into him. And he had no idea that this was only the beginning. The days grew warmer, and the sun lingered longer in the sky. Emily had begun settling into a rhythm with Daniel that felt gentle but purposeful. She never rushed him, never tried to force progress, and never acted as though he was fragile or incapable. Instead, she treated him as a person who could experience the world, even in small, quiet ways. That morning, she arrived with a small basket of objects she had collected from around the house, different textures, colors, and shapes. She placed them carefully on the floor beside Daniel's wheelchair. "Today," she said softly, "we're going to explore some new things together." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the basket. He didn't speak, but there was a spark of interest, a tiny change in his expression that Emily noticed immediately. She picked up a small fabric square, soft and slightly rough at the same time. She rubbed it against her cheek, then held it out to him. "This feels interesting, doesn't it? I think you might like it." He hesitated for a moment, then reached out. His fingers brushed the edge of the square. Emily smiled. "See? That wasn't so hard." One by one, she introduced him to the different items, a smooth stone, a feather, a small wooden block. Each time she spoke to him quietly, describing how it felt, how it looked, even what it reminded her of. Daniel didn't respond with words, but he responded in small ways. A blink, a turn of his head, a slight movement of his fingers. To anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant. To Emily, it was a victory. Richard, meanwhile, had been unusually quiet that day. He had a meeting at the office, but kept finding his thoughts drifting back to the house. He wondered what she was doing with Daniel now, how he was reacting. He told himself it didn't matter, that she was just a nanny and he had everything under control. But as he walked past Daniel's room on his way out, he froze. Emily was sitting on the floor, her legs folded beneath her, and Daniel was beside her, leaning slightly toward the basket. For the first time, Richard noticed the careful way she guided his son's hands, showing him how to touch each object. There was no rush, no pressure. She simply stayed beside him, present and attentive. Richard's chest tightened, He couldn't remember the last time he had seen someone interact with Daniel like this. He had been too busy, too afraid, too distant. And now, watching this quiet scene, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. Emily had a way of noticing small things, details that no one else seemed to see. She observed how Daniel's eyes lingered on bright colors longer than dull ones, how his hands reacted to soft textures but recoiled slightly from rough ones. She adjusted her approach based on these observations, finding ways to encourage him without making him feel pressured. By the afternoon, she had brought out a small drum. Daniel had never made a sound on it before. Emily demonstrated first, tapping it lightly with her fingers. Then she guided his hand, helping him tap once, twice, 3 times. The sound was soft and uneven, but it was a sound and it was his. Emily clapped quietly. "That's wonderful," she whispered. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as though surprised by what he had done. Richard walked past the window again. He didn't mean to watch, but he found himself frozen, observing. There was a connection happening, a bond forming between Emily and Daniel. It was not dramatic or loud, but it was real. And for the first time, Richard wondered what his own presence could mean in those moments. Evening came, and Emily guided Daniel to the small garden behind the mansion. The flowers had begun to bloom in clusters of colors, and the air was filled with the scent of earth and petals. She helped him touch the petals, explaining how soft they felt, describing the colors, letting him hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. He moved slightly, leaning toward her when she held a flower for him to touch. She smiled, encouraging him gently. "You're doing amazing," she said. "Look how much you can feel, how much you can notice." There was no rush, no judgment, only encouragement. Richard stood by the window again, a silent observer. His chest felt tight, his throat heavy. He wanted to step inside to see the full interaction, but he hesitated. He had been absent for too long, and he wasn't sure how to begin. Watching Emily, though, he realized that maybe she was showing him how. Over the next few days, Emily introduced music in small doses. She would play a single note on the piano and guide Daniel's fingers to touch it. At first, he was hesitant, unsure of what to do. But with patience, he began to press a key here and there, producing a sound that was uneven but full of potential. Emily celebrated each note, never making it about perfection, only about participation. Richard started noticing that the house was changing. The silence that had once been so oppressive was now punctuated with small sounds, soft taps on the piano, faint giggles, the clatter of toys, even the rustle of paper as Daniel engaged with a book. The atmosphere felt lighter, warmer, more alive. One afternoon, Emily brought out a small mirror and placed it in front of Daniel. She held it so he could see himself. At first, he didn't react. Then slowly, he touched his own reflection. Emily guided his hands gently. "That's you," she whispered. "That's who you are." He stared for a long time, tracing his own face with his fingers. There was a quiet wonder in his eyes, a recognition that had not been there before. Richard watched from the doorway, his emotions shifting. He had never thought of Daniel as someone who could notice himself, who could interact with the world in such subtle ways. And yet, here he was, slowly discovering a sense of self under Emily's gentle guidance. Evenings became the most magical part of the day. Emily would dim the lights in Daniel's room and read stories aloud. She had a calm voice, steady and soothing, that seemed to carry a sense of safety. Daniel would sit beside her, sometimes leaning on her shoulder, sometimes reaching for her hand. There were no demands, no pressure, only presence. Richard began to spend more time observing these moments. He felt a mixture of awe and regret. Awe at what Emily could do, regret at how little he had tried before. He saw the subtle joy in Daniel's eyes, the small movements that indicated understanding and engagement, and he felt a deep longing to connect with his son in the same way. One evening, after story time, Emily placed Daniel gently in his bed and tucked the blanket around him. She whispered goodnight, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could see the dim light of the hallway. Richard, standing in the shadows, felt a pull in his heart. He realized that Emily was not just helping Daniel. She was showing him, too, how to be present, how to care, how to reconnect with his own son. The weeks passed, and Daniel continued to respond in small, meaningful ways. He began to reach out more, to make tiny gestures that indicated recognition and curiosity. Emily celebrated every achievement quietly but sincerely, never overdoing praise, never treating him like a project. She simply acknowledged the small victories and encouraged him to explore further. Richard noticed these changes not only in Daniel but in himself. He began spending more time at home, stepping away from work when possible. He started to interact, hesitantly at first, but with growing awareness and care, he learned to watch, to listen, to recognize the small signs of progress. He discovered that connection was not about grand gestures, but about being present, about noticing the little things that made a difference. Emily, meanwhile, remained consistent. She was patient, attentive, and fully engaged. She never allowed frustration to show, never let disappointment cloud her interactions. She had an intuitive understanding of Daniel, a sense of what he needed even when he could not express it. Her calm presence became the anchor of the household, and slowly, Richard realized that he had been watching the transformation not just of his son, but of himself. One afternoon, Emily guided Daniel to the piano again. This time, she encouraged him to press a few notes in sequence, showing him the pattern of sounds. Daniel followed, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. The notes were uneven, some sharp, some flat, but they were his. Emily smiled softly. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "You made music." Richard stopped outside the room, unsure whether to enter. He felt a mixture of pride and awe and a deep sense of longing. He wanted to join them, to guide Daniel himself, but he hesitated. The fear of inadequacy held him back. Yet watching Emily, he understood that patience and presence mattered more than skill. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to imagine a life where he could be a part of these moments, not just an observer. He realized that Emily had given him something far more valuable than care for his son. She had given him hope, the hope that connection was still possible, that love could be rebuilt, that he could learn to be a father again. By the end of part 3, the house had transformed. The quiet walls were now alive with small sounds of life. Daniel's eyes were brighter, his gestures more intentional. Emily's presence had created a bridge between father and son, one built not on words but on patience, understanding, and human connection. And Richard knew, deep inside, that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change all their lives. Richard had always been cautious, always in control. He trusted very few people in his life, and after years of focusing on work, he had grown skeptical of anyone claiming to understand his son. Emily's progress with Daniel fascinated him, but it also unsettled him. He wondered if she was truly capable, or if she might one day disappoint him like the others had. One morning he called his assistant into his office. "I want a camera installed," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I need to know what happens when I'm not around." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, do you really think that's necessary? Emily seems competent." Richard shook his head. "It's not about competence. It's about proof. I need to see for myself. Make it discreet. I don't want her to know." The cameras were installed in Daniel's room and a few other key areas. They were small, hidden and designed to capture everything without being intrusive. Richard didn't tell anyone, not even Emily. For him, this was a way to protect his son, to verify that the care he was receiving was real. At first, the footage was unremarkable. Emily arrived in the morning, interacted with Daniel, helped him through small tasks, and left in the evening. But as Richard began watching more closely, he noticed subtleties he hadn't seen before. The way Emily adjusted her own posture to match Daniel's movements, the quiet encouragement in her voice, the small, gentle corrections she made without frustration. One afternoon, Richard stayed late in the office and reviewed footage from earlier that day. Emily had brought out a small wooden puzzle, the kind with shapes that needed to fit into corresponding spaces. Daniel hesitated at first, unsure of what to do. Emily knelt beside him, guiding his hands over the pieces, showing him how they could fit together. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. Emily wasn't just teaching him the puzzle. She was teaching him patience. She was teaching him that mistakes were okay, that trying again could lead to success. And Daniel was responding. Slowly, carefully, he began to place the pieces correctly. His face lit up with a small smile, and Emily clapped quietly, celebrating his effort rather than the result. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had never seen Daniel like this before, truly engaged and excited. And he had never realized how much he had missed by being absent. The next video was even more remarkable. It was late in the evening, and Emily had guided Daniel to the old piano in his room. The instrument was worn, some keys chipped, some sticking slightly. Most people would have dismissed it as useless. Emily didn't. She encouraged Daniel to touch the keys, to feel the vibrations, to explore the sounds. At first, he only pressed a single key hesitantly. Then another. Slowly, he began forming a tiny rhythm. Emily watched, her eyes gentle, her hands hovering close in case he needed help. Then for the first time, she placed her hand over his, guiding his fingers in a simple melody. Daniel's eyes widened as he realized he was making music, however small. Richard leaned back in his chair, unable to move. He had expected to see ordinary care, but instead he witnessed something extraordinary. A deep connection, patience, and love in its purest form. He realized he had underestimated the impact of Emily's presence. She wasn't just caring for his son, she was helping him discover himself. As the days passed, Richard watched more footage, each clip leaving him more unsettled and more awed. He saw Emily helping Daniel feed himself for the first time, guiding his hands carefully. He saw her reading stories aloud, patiently waiting as Daniel's attention wandered, returning to the story with her gentle encouragement. He saw small achievements, gestures, and moments that no one else had witnessed, all captured on camera. One night he stumbled upon footage that made him pause for an unusually long time. Emily had been sitting beside Daniel, who had reached for the piano keys again. She leaned close, softly singing a lullaby while guiding his fingers over the keys. Then she began humming a melody she had created, her voice low and tender. Daniel responded in his own way, pressing a key at the right moment. It was imperfect, uneven, and beautiful. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing. He had been absent not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to bridge the gap. And now, through the lens of a camera, he saw the bridge being built right in front of him. The most powerful moment came when he saw Emily wiping her own tears. She didn't try to hide them. She was emotional, moved by Daniel's progress. But it wasn't sadness for him, it was joy. She had experienced victories that Richard had never witnessed. Small breakthroughs that went unnoticed by the rest of the world. She had poured herself into Daniel's world, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Richard sat back, shaking his head. He had hired a nanny, expecting competence, expecting someone to care for Daniel in a professional way. What he hadn't expected was love, not in the abstract sense, not in the way of distant care, but a true, human love that was patient, gentle, and entirely selfless. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility that he had been wrong about many things. He had believed that money, status, and control could provide for his son. He had believed that being absent while efficient was enough. And now, watching Emily on the screen, he realized that it had never been enough. Daniel needed presence, attention, and connection. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the footage, remembering every small gesture, every note on the piano, every quiet smile. The images stayed with him, refusing to let him ignore what he had seen. He had been a bystander in his son's life, and now he felt the weight of what he had missed. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He would not confront Emily about the cameras, not yet. He needed time to understand what he had witnessed, time to prepare for what he wanted to do next. Instead, he focused on observing more quietly, letting the footage teach him how to connect. He noticed Emily's small routines, how she encouraged Daniel to explore textures, how she praised effort over achievement, how she celebrated tiny victories without fuss. She had taught him patience and presence without ever intending to teach Richard anything. And through her, he began to see his son not as someone fragile or limited, but as a person full of potential, waiting to be recognized and understood. Days turned into weeks, and Richard became increasingly aware of the change in Daniel. The boy was more responsive, more curious, and more engaged. He began reaching for objects with intention, reacting to sounds, and even mimicking simple movements. The transformation was slow and subtle, but undeniable. Richard realized that Emily's influence extended beyond teaching Daniel. She was showing him, his father, how to be present. He started stepping into the room during playtime, initially just observing, sometimes quietly joining in. He would guide Daniel's hand on the piano, help him with a puzzle, or simply sit beside him and describe what they saw in the garden. The first time Richard actively participated, Emily didn't comment. She simply continued her gentle encouragement, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Daniel responded to his father's touch in a way that was small but significant. Richard felt a warmth he had not experienced in years. He realized that he had been waiting for a miracle when the miracle had been there all along, quietly unfolding through patience, consistency, and love. Emily had not only helped Daniel discover the world, but she had helped Richard rediscover his role as a father. One evening, he watched a clip where Emily had guided Daniel to play a short tune on the piano. She hummed along softly, her eyes glistening, and Daniel's fingers pressed the keys in response. Richard leaned forward, heart pounding as the melody unfolded. It was imperfect, yet perfect in its own way, and for the first time, he felt a sense of connection that he had long thought impossible. The footage became a mirror, showing him what he had been missing and what could still be. He realized that caring for Daniel was not about control, schedules, or efficiency. It was about presence, attention, and unconditional support. Emily had modeled all of these qualities without a word of lecture or judgment. Richard finally understood the depth of what Emily had given them. She had brought patience where there was frustration, hope where there was despair, and love where there had been absence. She had not only cared for Daniel, she had transformed the household into a space of warmth and possibility. That night, Richard stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to bed. He reflected on the weeks of footage he had watched, the moments of joy and progress, the subtle shifts in Daniel's behavior, and the unwavering presence of Emily. He realized that what he had discovered was more than just the capability of a nanny. He had discovered the power of human connection, the quiet, persistent, transformative power of care and attention. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had thought lost forever: hope. Richard had watched enough footage to understand that Emily was not just doing her job. She was changing the way Daniel experienced the world, and in doing so, she had begun to change him as a father. For years he had been absent, hiding behind meetings, phone calls, and deadlines. Now he realized that presence mattered more than perfection, more than wealth, more than control. It started small. One afternoon he found himself lingering outside Daniel's room. Emily was there as usual, kneeling beside his wheelchair. She was guiding his hands over a puzzle, gently encouraging him to place the pieces in the correct spots. Daniel's concentration was absolute, and for the first time Richard noticed the quiet pride on Emily's face. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. Without thinking, he stepped inside. Emily looked up, surprised but calm. "Sir," she said softly. Richard nodded. I'd like to join today." Emily smiled, but she didn't let it change the flow of the moment. She simply moved aside slightly, making space for him. Richard felt awkward at first, unsure of what to do. He hadn't handled Daniel's care for years, and he feared he would do something wrong. But Emily's quiet confidence encouraged him to try. He knelt beside Daniel, carefully guiding his son's hands over the puzzle pieces. At first, Daniel didn't react. Then slowly he began to move his fingers in the right places. Richard's heart lifted. He realized that connection didn't require words. It didn't require speeches or grand gestures. It required presence, patience, and attention. Over the next few days, Richard started joining more activities. He would sit beside Daniel as Emily read aloud, listening quietly, occasionally pointing out pictures or making soft comments. He would guide Daniel's fingers over the piano keys, following Emily's example, feeling a thrill each time his son produced a note, however small. The first real breakthrough came one afternoon when Emily introduced a simple matching game. Daniel had to place colored shapes onto a board in the correct pattern. Richard guided his hands gently at first, then allowed him to try on his own. For the first time, Daniel completed a row without help. His face lit up, a small but genuine smile spreading across his lips. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. He realized that he had been absent for too long, missing moments that were small but monumental. Emily had shown him how to celebrate the little victories, how to be patient and present, and now he was starting to understand the joy that came from simply being there. One evening, Emily suggested they try music again. She guided Daniel to the piano and showed him a simple pattern of notes. Richard sat beside him, placing his hands over Daniel's and helping him press the keys. At first, the sounds were uneven, jarring even, but as they repeated the sequence, a recognizable melody emerged. Daniel's eyes widened and he pressed the keys more confidently. Richard felt a warmth spread through him he hadn't felt in years. This was not about work or achievement. It was about connection. It was about a father rediscovering his role in his son's life, about a boy experiencing his own abilities in a world that had often overlooked him. Emily continued to guide them, but she let Richard take the lead more and more. She offered gentle suggestions, encouraged patience, and celebrated each small success. Slowly, Richard learned how to read Daniel's subtle cues, an eye movement, a twitch of a finger, a shift in expression. He began to understand that communication was not always verbal, that connection could be built through touch, presence, and empathy. The change in the household was remarkable. The silence that had once filled every room was now replaced with sounds of life, soft music, the tapping of puzzle pieces, quiet laughter, and the occasional clatter of toys. Daniel's expressions were more varied, his movements more deliberate. He began reaching out, exploring the world around him with curiosity and confidence. Richard noticed something else too. He was changing as well. He found himself leaving work earlier, prioritizing moments with his son. He began to speak softly, not just to Daniel, but to himself, reflecting on the lessons Emily had quietly taught him. He realized that patience, presence, and empathy were skills he could develop, not just traits he had been born with. One afternoon, Emily suggested an outdoor activity. She wheeled Daniel to the garden and Richard followed. The sun was warm and the flowers were in bloom. Emily showed Daniel the petals, guiding his fingers over the textures, letting him feel the breeze and listen to the sounds of the garden. Richard hesitated, unsure how to participate. Emily noticed but didn't push. Instead, she handed him a small flower. "Show him," she said softly. "Let him see what you notice." Richard knelt beside Daniel, holding the flower gently. "Look at this," he said. "See the colors? Feel the petals?" Daniel's hands moved toward the flower, his fingers brushing it lightly. Richard felt a surge of joy. He realized that for years he had been absent from these simple, beautiful moments. Now he was present, and it felt more powerful than any business victory he had ever achieved. That evening, Richard reflected on the weeks that had passed. He had been distant, fearful and uncertain, but now he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Emily had guided Daniel's growth, but she had also guided him, showing him how to be a father, how to connect, and how to experience life in small, meaningful ways. The first true emotional breakthrough came one night when Emily suggested they play a simple duet on the piano. Daniel sat in his wheelchair, Emily beside him and Richard on the other side. She showed them a simple melody, guiding Daniel's hands and Richard's hands over the keys. At first, the notes were hesitant, uneven, and clumsy. Then something remarkable happened. Daniel pressed the right keys, producing the melody correctly. Richard joined in, feeling the rhythm, matching the sequence. Together, the three of them played, imperfect but harmonious. Daniel's face lit up in pure delight. He reached for Richard's hand, pressing it gently. Richard felt tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he realized the depth of what he had been missing. The years of absence, the focus on work, the emotional distance, all of it had created a void. And now, through patience, presence, and the guidance of a kind-hearted woman, he was reconnecting with his son in a way he had never imagined possible. The next few days were filled with similar moments. Richard spent more time at home, joining Emily in teaching Daniel, celebrating small victories, and discovering the joy of presence. He began to notice subtle changes in himself, less frustration, more patience, and a growing sense of empathy. Emily, as always, remained the quiet guide. She never overshadowed the moments, never took control for herself. She encouraged Richard to step forward, to participate, and to connect with Daniel. And slowly he learned not only to guide his son, but also to follow, to respond, and to understand. One afternoon, Richard watched Daniel respond to a story in a new way. Emily had read aloud about a boy exploring a forest. Daniel's eyes widened at the description of the trees, and he reached toward the illustrations, mimicking the actions of the character. Richard leaned in, pointing to the shapes and colors, gently reinforcing the story. Daniel's smile grew, and he pressed his tiny fingers against the page as if he could feel the world through it. Richard felt a wave of emotion. He realized that these moments, small and simple as they were, held more value than any deal or business success. Presence mattered more than perfection. Connection mattered more than control. And love mattered more than anything else he had ever pursued. By the end of part 5, the household had completely transformed. The once silent mansion now echoed with the sounds of life and joy. Daniel was more engaged, more responsive, and more expressive. Richard was no longer the distant, work-focused father he had been. He was learning to be present, patient, and attentive. And Emily, the quiet, steady force behind it all, continued to guide them both, showing that love and attention could transform not only a child's life but a father's heart as well. Richard had discovered the truth that the cameras could only hint at. Care was not about control or monitoring. It was about connection, patience, and the willingness to show up. And he now knew that he was ready to fully show up for his son, to embrace the journey that lay ahead.